There is a story most investors tell themselves about how wealth is built. It involves the right decision made at the right moment, the investment identified before others recognized its value, the strategy held with conviction through uncertainty and noise, the single insight that separated a successful outcome from an average one. This story is appealing because it places outcomes within reach of intelligence and effort. If wealth is the product of brilliant decisions, then the path forward is simply to make better ones. Study more, analyze deeper, choose more carefully. But the evidence, examined honestly, tells a quieter and considerably less flattering story. Financial outcomes are shaped less by the brilliance of a few decisions than by the accumulated weight of many small ones. Not the dramatic choices that are remembered, analysed, and discussed afterward. The ordinary ones. The ones that felt reasonable at the time and left no particular trace in memory. The ones that seemed, in isolation, like responsible responses to real conditions. Bad decisions behave like attacks, not the kind that arrives as a single identifiable charge that can be examined and understood. The kind collected in small increments across years, distributed so evenly across time that no single payment ever feels significant enough to examine carefully. This is what makes the tax so persistent, not its size in any individual moment, but its consistency across all of them. The mechanism behind this is worth understanding with some precision, because its invisibility is precisely what makes it so consequential over time. Consider the individual errors as they actually appear in practice. Selling a position slightly early because the gain felt sufficient and the remaining uncertainty felt uncomfortable to hold. Entering a trade after a period of strong momentum because recent price action made the thesis feel more validated than the fundamentals actually supported. Abandoning a long-term strategy during a drawdown because the discomfort of watching it underperform became genuinely difficult to sustain through consecutive quarters. Reacting to a significant headline with a portfolio adjustment that the headline itself did not logically warrant. Each of these decisions, examined individually, appears minor and often defensible. The cost in any single instance is small enough to rationalize and small enough to eventually forget. But compounding does not evaluate decisions individually or in isolation. It operates on the accumulated base of every decision that has preceded the current one. Every small error reduces the base from which future returns compound. A portfolio interrupted at the wrong moment, a gain taken slightly too early, a recovery missed because a position was liquidated into the drawdown that preceded it. Each of these slightly alters the trajectory of everything that follows. Because compounding is exponential rather than linear, small reductions in the base produce disproportionately large reductions in the eventual outcome. The tax registers as invisible in any given year. Across 2 decades, it is often the difference between 2 entirely different financial lives lived by the same person. The question worth sitting with is not simply what these errors cost in retrospect. It is why they happen with such regularity across investors of genuinely varying intelligence, experience, and stated commitment to long-term thinking. The answer is not ignorance of the correct principles. Most investors who sell into a drawdown understand, in principle, that drawdowns are temporary features of markets rather than terminal events. Most investors who chase recent performance understand, in principle, that past returns carry limited predictive information about future ones. The problem is not a shortage of correct information or sound frameworks. It is the distance between what is understood intellectually and what is felt viscerally in the moment, an actual decision under real uncertainty is required. Human beings are not psychologically wired for the emotional conditions that financial markets consistently and reliably create. Rising prices generate excitement that feels in the body like evidence of genuine quality and confirmed thesis. Falling prices generate fear that feels like evidence of real danger requiring immediate protective action. Headlines create a sense of urgency that feels like a genuine requirement to respond before the window closes. Watching other investors generate visible returns in assets you chose not to hold creates a social pressure that is genuinely difficult to sit with calmly across extended periods of underperformance. These are not weaknesses unique to unsophisticated or undisciplined people. They are features of human psychology that were adaptive and survival-oriented in environments fundamentally different from modern capital markets. The nervous system cannot easily distinguish between genuine physical threat and portfolio volatility represented by numbers on a screen. The social instincts that make human beings effective and trustworthy in cooperative groups make genuinely independent long-term thinking difficult to sustain under the pressure of visible comparison. Markets do not create these emotional triggers accidentally or without consequence. Volatility, news cycles, and the continuous visibility of other investors' returns all function as persistent inputs to a psychological system that was not designed to process them without producing some form of reactive response. The result is a steady and largely predictable production of small behavioral errors distributed across millions of participants in every market cycle. Most of these participants are responding reasonably to how the situation feels rather than irrationally to how it actually is. The feeling is real even when the signal it points toward is not. When this pattern operates simultaneously across enough participants, the consequences become structurally visible in markets themselves. Excessive trading volume accumulates friction and tax drag without producing insight or edge. Momentum effects emerge and persist, driven by investors entering positions because prices are rising rather than because underlying business value supports the current price. Panic selling concentrates at the precise moments when long-term capital should theoretically be most actively deployed. Sound strategies with genuine, long-term validity are abandoned during the periods of underperformance that are not aberrations but inherent and expected features of every serious approach. What this produces in aggregate is a persistent and largely invisible transfer of wealth, not from the unintelligent to the intelligent as the conventional story suggests, from the behaviorally inconsistent to the behaviorally stable, from the investors who react to the investors who do not. The people paying the invisible tax are typically entirely unaware they are paying it, because the cost is never concentrated in a single, recognizable, catastrophic event. It is diffused across enough individually defensible decisions that no single payment ever triggers the kind of serious reflection that might interrupt the pattern. Here is where the dynamic becomes most interesting for investors who consider themselves analytically capable and intellectually serious about markets. Intelligence does not provide immunity from the invisible tax. In several specific and well-documented ways, it makes the problem more durable rather than less. The analytically capable investor who makes an emotionally driven decision does not experience it as an emotional decision. They experience it as a conclusion reached through careful and systematic reasoning. The narrative constructed around the choice is sophisticated enough to be genuinely convincing, particularly to the person who constructed it under the pressure of the moment. This is among the more consistent findings across decades of behavioral finance research. Intelligent people do not make meaningfully fewer emotional decisions than less analytically oriented ones. They make emotional decisions that are substantially better justified and rationalized after the fact. The underlying behavior remains reactive and driven by the same psychological triggers affecting every other participant. The explanation constructed around that behavior becomes more elaborate, more internally coherent, and therefore more resistant to honest examination, which means the error is significantly less likely to be recognized as an error, and therefore considerably less likely to be corrected before it repeats across the next cycle. The investor without the vocabulary to construct a sophisticated justification for selling into a drawdown at least experiences the decision with some residual uncertainty. The intelligent investor who sells into the same drawdown can typically produce a coherent and detailed argument for why this particular drawdown is meaningfully different from previous ones, why the original thesis has been genuinely invalidated by recent developments, why this represents disciplined and rational risk management rather than an emotional response to temporary discomfort. The tax is paid either way and with equal mathematical consequence. The intelligent investor simply pays it with considerably more confidence and considerably less likelihood of learning from it. The investors who avoid this tax consistently over long periods are not distinguished primarily by the accuracy of their forecasts or the sophistication of their analytical frameworks. They are distinguished by the frequency of their reactions to conditions that do not actually require a response. This is a structural edge, and it is worth being precise about what it actually consists of in practice. It is not passivity or indifference to what markets are doing. It is the product of having built, in advance of pressure arriving, a relationship with uncertainty that does not require continuous resolution to remain functional. A sufficiently clear understanding of what is owned and why, such that short-term price movements do not reliably trigger the psychological conditions that produce reactive and value-destroying decisions. Fewer decisions across time means fewer opportunities for behavioral error to accumulate into meaningful compounding drag. Longer time horizons mean that the specific triggers activating emotional responses in shorter-term participants simply fall outside the relevant decision framework. Stability maintained during volatility is not an absence of awareness about what is happening. It is the presence of a prior framework that has already accounted for volatility as an expected and manageable condition rather than a novel signal requiring an immediate portfolio response. These investors allow compounding to operate without the interruptions that erode its mathematical power. Which sounds straightforward until it is held against the actual behavioral record of how genuinely difficult, uninterrupted compounding is to sustain across a complete market cycle that includes real drawdowns, real underperformance, and real social pressure. Wealth is not primarily built through extraordinary insight or decisions timed with unusual precision. More often, across the long record of investors who actually compound successfully across decades, it is built through the sustained avoidance of ordinary mistakes repeated across entirely ordinary market conditions. The most expensive errors in investing are rarely dramatic enough to be recalled with clarity or discussed as cautionary examples. They do not feel like catastrophes at the moment they occur. They feel like reasonable, considered responses to the genuine conditions present at the time. They feel quite often like exactly the prudent and responsible choice, but accumulated across years, distributed across dozens of individually defensible decisions, they form a tax on the future that was being quietly and patiently constructed with every sound decision that came before them. The tax is invisible in the moment it is paid. The compounding it quietly and persistently interrupts is not.